The Daily Wire's Ben Shapiro has a proposal for President Trump. It involves a pardon. Here he is on his show recommending a pardon for, let's watch.
If we are issuing pardons, however, there is one person that President Trump should pardon from federal charges forthwith. It would be incredibly controversial, but I think that it's absolutely necessary. That person is Derek Chauvin. President Trump should, in fact, pardon Derek Chauvin. He should. He should pardon him his federal charges. When it came to BLM, the inciting event for the BLM riots that caused $2 billion in property damage in the United States and set America's race relations on their worst footing in my lifetime, was in fact the railroading of Derek Chauvin in the death of George Floyd. Nonetheless, on the basis of extraordinarily scanty evidence, and despite the fact that there was massive pressure on the jury, that the mayor of Minneapolis paid a settlement to the George Floyd family immediately, that the President of the United States suggested that Derek Chauvin was guilty right off the bat, that the jurors were being openly threatened and admitted as much. Despite all of that, Derek Chauvin was convicted on federal charges and pled guilty to federal charges.
Shapiro and other co-signers sent a letter to Trump asking him to pardon Derek Chauvin, the Minneapolis police officer who was convicted of killing George Floyd in 2020.
The killing of George Floyd is credited with sparking Black Lives Matter during the pandemic. Protests erupted across the nation calling for restraints on police and how they operated. It spurred a movement to defund the police. Many critics believed it led to an increase in crime.
Ben Shapiro's letter reads in part, George Floyd was high on fentanyl. He had a significant pre-existing heart condition. He was saying he could not breathe before he was even out of the car. Derek Chauvin, for large segments of the widely circulated video of the encounter, had his knee on George Floyd's shoulder or back, not on his neck. This was confirmed by the autopsy, which showed no damage to George Floyd's trachea. Shapiro ended by thanking Trump for committing to ending the weaponization of the justice system.
Robert Samuels, Washington Post reporter and author of His Name is George Floyd, took to X to dispel some notions around Floyd's case. Firstly, Samuel says Floyd didn't die of an overdose, as some on the right claim. Chauvin's defense didn't even make the argument Floyd died of an overdose. Leading pulmonologist Martin Tobin's testimony compelled jurors the most, according to Samuels. He pointed out that Chauvin's knee did shift, but it spent most of the time with its weight on a sensitive part of the neck. Two separate juries convicted Chauvin. In a federal trial, the jury found Chauvin guilty of violating Floyd's civil rights. In a state trial, the jury found Chauvin guilty of second-degree murder.
But senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, Christopher Rufo, wrote on X, the reality is that Derek Chauvin was made into a scapegoat. His verdict was reached under social duress. The jurors, and by proxy the country, realized that a not guilty decision would plunge America into riots and chaos. So we all shamefully accepted his condemnation. Elon Musk chimed in, as he tends to do from time to time, about 1,000 times every minute. Something to think about.
Contributing writer to The Atlantic, Jamel Hill, wrote, nothing to see here, just Elon Musk suggesting Derek Chauvin should be federally pardoned for murdering George Floyd.
I have a feeling you're not going to be a fan of this pardon, Lynda. Look, unlike many others on the right who, I don't know exactly what they're trying to do here, I have no problem asserting that Derek Chauvin's actions with respect to George Floyd were totally improper. He was kneeling on part of him for 10 minutes, and it was a situation where the suspect, George Floyd, was under they had him. They could have just handcuffed him and put him in the car. And the lack of urgency to just do that would have resolved the situation. So the way Derek Chauvin handled it was not appropriate, was not in line with police training, and so I have no problem criticizing him for that or holding him responsible for the death of George Floyd. Now, it is true and has been pointed out by many conservatives that he had drugs in his system and health problems, etc. So who knows exactly what combination of factors necessarily killed him, but even if there were other factors at play, the police officer should not have pinned him down in that way for so long, so it's kind of moot.
Yeah, look, I think it was a very, very dark time in our nation's history, and I think the reason we saw such an incredible outpouring of rage and grief was because what was witnessed on camera in George Floyd's death really reflected fears that Black Americans felt about the way they are perceived and the way that law enforcement has treated them in their own communities. And I think that is not something that you're going to erase nor address by pardoning.
Here's where I mean, I agree that, yes, I don't think Derek Chauvin needs a pardon. But here's where we part ways, because this did become, yes, such an important and foundational issue for Black Lives Matter, a movement and particularly an organization that I think turned into a huge grift by the leaders of it, taking in all this money and donations to purchase hype houses or something of that nature, touching off a summer of widespread rioting and violence and property destruction that did not start to heal the racial divide in the country. And furthermore, while I agree, of course, that there is evidence that there is some level of bias, racial bias in policing, although it's a little bit more difficult to see in the data than people assert. You can certainly be mistreated by the police if you're any other ethnicity as well. In fact, being poor, being lower income is probably the highest correlating factor with being mistreated by the police. It just so happens there are more African Americans who fall into that category. All that said, there was no evidence ever presented that this encounter, that what happened, had anything to do with race. Has anyone ever put forth a shred of evidence that Derek Chauvin's actions, wrong though they were motivated by racial animus? No one has ever suggested that. And yet this is George Floyd became the poster child for racist treatment at the hands of the police, even though there's no evidence that it was racially motivated here at all. That's what always throws me about this case.
Well, I think that it was the straw that broke the camel's back, and that it's no accident that there has been continued discussion about it. I do want to make sure that we're not conflating the Black Lives Matter movement with the Defund the Police initiative that came after. People who have followed me over the years know I actually did an analysis on some of these issues coming off of the 2020 electoral cycle, and actually, interestingly, the defund the police efforts may actually have done some damage to the Democratic Party, in particular among Latino and Black communities, which felt like that really didn't speak to exactly what the point was as part of this whole larger public discussion, which I think remains really important to this day.
Certainly. I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think people who actually live in troubled communities, I mean, it's both. They feel, in many cases, correctly and fairly, that they are both mistreated. They're both mistreated by the police, or in their police interactions are poor. They feel over-policed, but also that the police services are not adequate because they're not sufficiently deterring crime, stopping crime, arresting criminals, and the communities are unsafe. So they both want to be treated better by the police, and also feel like the services they're getting from the police aren't very good. But you're right. If you talk to people in places where there was protesting and rioting and the local convenience store got burned down, ask them whether they want the police abolished. They say, "Are you kidding? Are you crazy?"
Exactly.
That's some left-wing campus idea.
Yeah.
And I think it did do some harm. And certainly, yes, I support the goals of criminal justice reform. I oppose racial profiling of suspects by police, obviously. I think I want people's civil liberties respected. I want police to wear body cams for the suspect's good and for their own. I support a lot of these things, certainly. The leaders of the movement ended up being some grifting individuals, it seems to me.
So I want to go back for a second to something you said earlier about data. The unfortunate truth is that there are some significant bodies of data that show that policing is more intense in Black and brown communities, and in some cases inadvertently incentivized by federal government grants for law enforcement, which have led to increased police stops and things of that nature in communities of color.
Well, no, I don't disagree that the data shows that, but also there's more poverty and more crime disproportionately in these areas. So the question is the increased level of policing right or wrong, or does it correlate with there being more crime in these areas because of, and you can say that's because of the historic legacy of the way Black people have been mistreated in America, that they are more likely to be poor or disadvantaged by our legal system or our economic system because of the way they were treated, and so they're more likely to live in areas where there is poverty, and where there is poverty, there is more likely to be crime, independent of race. It's just that race, because of our unique history, correlates with poverty. And so there is more policing, but the policing might be appropriate to the fact that there's more crime.
But the policing and the data actually show it's still disproportionately more prevalent, even if you overlay the incidence of crime.
Yeah, if you control for poverty, I don't know that it is. And I just never want people to think that the police can't mistreat you because you're white or something. It happens to poor people disproportionately all the time.
So what I think doesn't happen unless you are a Black American or a Latino American is that you don't have to sit your child down and tell them you have to behave a certain way if you are ever stopped by a police officer because it may cost you your life. And
that's bad advice, Lynda. Everybody should have that conversation
well,
with their kids.
this may be true, but what I'm saying is that the experience, the lived experience of Black Americans in this country has been such that that is a conversation that happens regularly. And that's not something that I see reflected in any other community.
Well, everybody should have that conversation because it can happen to anyone. It just won't be turned into a hashtag unless it happens to a minority person. It can still happen. There was this famous body cam footage of this horrific shooting in a hotel. I can't remember the man's name. White guy killed in just this utterly appalling police brutality instance. It does happen. It just doesn't attract the same kind of attention. Maybe it happens I'm not arguing or dismissing that it happens disproportionately to people of color. That is the case. But it doesn't just happen to people of color. It is because for me as a libertarian, it's a government versus the citizens issue. Our police are government employees who work for us, and they have to comport themselves with a standard of behavior the way that there are employees. Now, that doesn't mean they have a difficult and important job, and they deserve our respect and our thanks. They put their lives on the line, absolutely. We need police. I don't want to defund the police at all. I think in some areas less policing is called for, in some areas more policing is called for. I'm absolutely in favor of that. We need to solve more homicides. Absolutely. The police resources in the city of D.C. are inadequate right now. That's been a recurring problem, that there are not as many police officers as there used to be. And I think that has contributed to an increase in crime in this city specifically. Last year, things are a little bit better this year. So I'm all for that.
Look, I think that when you see widespread pain, anger, grief, what we just talked about, in any community, that is something that we should be paying really close attention to. The same way we have these discussions about white working class voters, for example, who were very clear about the concerns that they have had increasingly over both Democratic and Republican administrations over the past several decades now. I think that these two things are related in a way, right? We're just not paying attention to what people are saying are troubling them and impacting their lives.
Let us know what you think. Up next, could the war of words between China and the U.S. become even more of an actual war? We'll discuss. Stay with us.